Tora, Tora, Tora movie review. So this is another classic film. This came out in 1970. And I guess like a lot of classic films, probably more people know about it than have actually seen it. Or at least that's my guess. I certainly knew about this film for years before I finally got around to seeing it. But if you're unfamiliar with it, I'll try and recap the background briefly. The movie came out in 1970. It's about Pearl Harbor. And what makes this movie unique is they attempted to do it from both the Japanese perspective and the American perspective. So there were two film crews. One film crew was in Japan with Japanese directors and Japanese actors kind of filming all the Japanese scenes. And one film crew was in America filming the American scenes, and then it got kind of put together into one movie. If you can get a hold of the DVD for this, I'd highly recommend it because the director's commentary is fascinating. They go into kind of all the behind-the-scenes stuff for this. And the behind-the-scenes stuff is almost actually more interesting than the actual movie. For example, the original Japanese director kind of on board for this was Akira Kurosawa. Right? Akira Kurosawa is like the legendary Japanese film director. Like pretty much any old Japanese movie that's famous, he did it. I mean, Seven Samurai, Rashomon, Yojimbo. He did all like the old famous Japanese movies. And it was widely regarded as a genius in his time and kind of today. So he was attached to the movie, and he ended up getting kind of let go in the middle of it. And actually, they go into some of the details in this DVD commentary, and there's like this whole long story. But to summarize, basically it boiled down to him just being an obsessive perfectionist. And when he was making films in Japan, the Japanese studios would let him be an obsessive perfectionist about stuff. But when you're making kind of movies for American studios, the budget and the timing and the schedule and everything's a lot more kind of locked in. So he was not able to make that transition. So instead they ended up bringing out, I think, a couple new guys, but one of them being Kinji Fukusaku, who is famous for a lot of his new wave Yakuza movies, but was also famous near the end of his career for the Battle Royale movie, which came out at the end of the 90s. So a lot of very kind of famous people attached to this. Well, while I'm talking about the DVD commentary, this isn't quite as important, but I thought it was interesting. They talked about how early on, a lot of the footage that was coming from Japan just featured so much overacting that they had to send it back. Now, I lived in Japan for a number of years and kind of am familiar with the Japanese style of acting or kind of filmmaking, which does tend to be kind of, yeah, they do tend to kind of overact more than Americans do, or it's a different style, I guess. I read somewhere that kind of Japanese movie kind of tends to have more of its roots in kind of the theater tradition, so people kind of act more like they're in a theater. But yeah, it is kind of jarring to Americans sometimes to watch Japanese media with what seems to us to be overacting. So I thought it was interesting that also turned out to be an issue in the making of this movie. So this movie is meticulously accurate about the story of Pearl Harbor. There are some mistakes and inaccuracies in here, and if you go to Wikipedia, they list a whole bunch of them. I read through the Wikipedia article. I thought those were kind of mostly nitpicks. I mean, small things, but I guess, you can read it for yourself and be the judge of that. But certainly as Hollywood movies go, by comparison, really very historically accurate. Which is kind of a shame that this movie didn't do so well. I mean, obviously it wasn't forgotten, We wouldn't be talking about it right now if it was completely forgotten. But it did kind of get overshadowed a bit. I think more people, unfortunately, are familiar with that Michael Bay, Ben Affleck movie instead of this. And this, you know, if you're a history nerd like I am, this is definitely the preferable movie. It almost feels at points like a docudrama. I mean, it's not, they take some liberties, but you know, a lot of the script from this movie is kind of like verbatim off of official records. And even when it's not verbatim, they are kind of meticulously kind of going through everything. So it's got that feel of kind of somehow being somewhere between a movie and a documentary. Even though it's really a movie, it just has that feel of it. So the film is telling two separate stories. On the Japanese side, it's telling kind of everything that led up to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And on the American side, it's kind of going through all the reasons why we missed Pearl Harbor, or why this kind of took us by surprise. And it turns out, once you get into it, that actually there were like so many reasons why we missed this attack. Like, there were so many signs that we should have seen coming, but we misinterpreted them for one reason or another. Which is interesting. I'll come back to that in a moment. But, you know, just in terms of how enjoyable the movie is, or, you know, the review of the movie watching experience. This does unfortunately have kind of it takes a narrative momentum out of it a little bit. Because instead of having like a sense that you're building to a climax, you have a sense of like inevitability. Like, you already know that this is going to end with the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor and the Americans not being ready. And so it's just a sense of like, oh, okay, they missed that. Oh, and they missed that. And they missed that. And just kind of I don't know, just kind of a sense of like a endless series of things that got missed that lead to the outcome we already know. And you know, I think part of this is because, like, in real life just wasn't a series of things leading up to Pearl Harbor. Real life was like a whole bunch of things actually happening. And it's only when you go back through it and kind of pick out all the missed signals that led to us not realizing Pearl Harbor, then it kind of does seem like an endless series of events where we just were not picking up on the obvious. And I suspect that this isn't just me. I suspect that this is part of the reason why this film was a flop commercially, which is unfortunate because it's a really cool idea to do a joint Japanese-American production on the attack on Pearl Harbor. I'm going to go on a little bit of a digression here and kind of talk about maybe some of the historical issues. This is related to the film, obviously, but it's also a bit of a digression. So if you want to stop watching here, fair enough. But when I was in college, I did a report for one of my classes on the conspiracy theories around Pearl Harbor. I wasn't endorsing any of these conspiracy theories. I was just doing a report on the fact that they existed. So there are these conspiracy theories that the U.S. government, or Franklin Roosevelt, knew full well that the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor. And they just kind of kept it a secret because they wanted an excuse to get into the war. So these, I don't actually believe these, but the logic of the theories is based on, one, the fact that we missed so many signals about the attack. Two, and kind of related, we got actually warned about this attack by a number of friendly governments who kind of sent us warnings, which got ignored or not picked up on. And then three, like the actual targets of the attack, the aircraft carriers that the Japanese were looking to take out, were actually not in Pearl Harbor that day. They were out doing like training or something like that. So the Japanese actually missed their targets. So, yeah, you can see why people would say, Roosevelt knew about it all along, so he had those ships moved out so that the Japanese had their attack, but that they didn't hit their targets. I don't actually believe that. I think it's just a coincidence. sometimes there are coincidences in life. And my professor made a comment, about kind of all these mixed signals and warnings that the U.S. government got that didn't act upon. And he said, until something actually happens, I mean, in retrospect, you realize, of course, that these warnings were serious, but at the time it was just so far out of their imaginations that something like this would happen. I mentioned that because that's kind of all in the film, but there's another interesting thing which gets into another subject, which is kind of the mindset of people who believe conspiracy theories, or kind of the problem of conspiracy theories, maybe, because I have over the years become concerned about conspiracy theories. When I was young, 18, 19, I bought into them a little bit, the JFK, RFK, Martin Luther King. I thought, yeah, CIA was probably behind it or something like that. But after 9/11, and after I think the left really wasted a lot of energy going after these ridiculous conspiracy theories, I've become a lot more critical about them and saying, theoretically anything can be possible, but you've got to keep one foot in reality. You can't go off on these crazy conspiracy theories. And, well, so I guess that's my background. Another issue with way of looking at this is kind of conspiracy theories by its nature is a derogatory term. It's a little bit hard to talk about conspiracy theories in a neutral way because the term carries connotations. Something's either plausible or it's just a conspiracy theory. That's just a crazy conspiracy theory, implying it's just kind of for the kooks. But, this stuff does have different kind of currency in different places. Like in Japan, this conspiracy theory that Franklin Roosevelt actually knew about Pearl Harbor, or the U.S. government actually knew about the attack ahead of time and just let it happen, is not like something on the fringes. It's actually fairly mainstream. It makes its way into a lot of Japanese media and stuff like that, that they actually, a fair amount of Japanese people do believe that Franklin Roosevelt did know about the attack ahead of time. In fact, I used to argue this with some of my Japanese friends. But then the other point, I guess this is what I'm kind of building up to here. This is what fascinates me a little bit. The United States government totally knew that Japan was planning an attack. That's not conspiracy theory, that's just history. We didn't know they were planning to attack Pearl Harbor, or they didn't know. The American government didn't know the attack was going to be at Pearl Harbor. They thought it was going to be in the Philippines. Reason was not because they didn't think Japan was going to attack us. They knew Japan was planning an attack. They just didn't think that Pearl Harbor was vulnerable because it was too shallow, so you couldn't shoot the torpedoes in. What they didn't realize is that the Japanese had kind of figured out a way to kind of dive the planes down and just kind of skim the surface with a torpedo or something technical like that. They figured out a way that they could actually attack Pearl Harbor. So, but that's the interesting part. And, nobody really tells you this in school. They just say here we were, we had no idea that the Japanese were going to attack, and then Americans woke up one morning, and then, fair enough, the American people had no idea that Japan was going to attack, but the American government knew. So I guess the point I'm making is just this, it's interesting. It's an interesting little distinction, because if you say the American government knew about the attack on Pearl Harbor in advance, then boy, you are crazy. You're out there in crazy conspiracy land. But if you say the American government knew that the Japanese were going to attack somewhere, then that's actually established history. I mention that because this is a point that gets kind of made over and over in this film. And again, a lot of this actually based on transcripts and documents and stuff like that. I hate to be the guy who's citing a Hollywood film to prove my point, but I'm fairly sure this film is very historically accurate. the American government totally knew that the attack was coming. The surprise part was that they didn't know it was coming in Pearl Harbor. They thought the attack would be like in the Philippines or one of America's other territories out in that direction. So that's just a little digression. Sorry about that. Point being, I guess, this film is worth checking out, and if at all possible, try and get the director's DVD commentary.